Chapter XIII of A Small Boy and Others. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by M.B. A Small Boy and Others by Henry James. Chapter XIII. Let me hurry, however, to catch again that thread I left dangling from my glance at our small vague spasms of school. My personal sense of them being as vague and small, I mean, in contrast with the fuller and stronger cup meted out all round to the Albany cousins, much more privileged, I felt, in every stroke of fortune, or at least more interesting, though it must be wicked to call them more happy, through those numberless bereavements that had so enriched their existence. I mentioned above, in particular, the enviable consciousness of our little red-headed kinsman Gus Barker, who, as by a sharp prevision, snatched what gaiety he might from a life to be cut short, in a cavalry dash, by one of the Confederate bullets of 1863. He blew out at us on New York Sundays, as I have said, sharp puffs of the atmosphere of the Institution Chevalier, strong to us, that is, the atmosphere of whose institutions was weak. But it was above all during a gregarious visit paid him in a livelier field still that I knew myself merely mothered and brothered. It had been his fate to be but scantly the latter and never at all the former. Our Aunt Janet had not survived his birth, but on this day of our collective pilgrimage to Sing Sing, where he was at "military" school, and clad in a fashion that represented to me the very panoply of war, he shone with a rare radiance of privation. Ingenuous and responsive, of a social disposition, a candour of gaiety, that matched his physical activity, the most beautifully made, athletic little person, and in the highest degree appealing and engaging, he not only did us the honours of his dazzling academy, dazzling at least to me, but had all the air of showing us over the great state prison which even then flourished near at hand and to which he accompanied us, a party of a composition that comes back to me as wonderful, the New York and Albany cousinships appearing to have converged and met for that happy occasion, with the generations and sexes melting together and moving in a loose harmonious band. The party must have been less numerous than by the romantic tradition or confused notation of my youth, and what I mainly remember of it, beyond my sense of our being at once an attendant train to my aged and gentle and in general most unadventurous grandmother, and a chorus of curiosity and amusement round about the vivid Gussie, is our collective impression that state prisons were on the whole delightful places, vast, bright and breezy, with a gay, free circulation in corridors and on stairs, a pleasant prevalence of hot soup and fresh crusty rolls, in tins, of which visitors admiringly partook, and for the latter, in chance corners and on sunny landings, much interesting light brush of gentlemen remarkable but for gentlemanly crimes, that is defalcations and malversations to striking and impressive amounts. I recall our coming on such a figure at the foot of a staircase and his having been announced to us by our conductor or friend in charge as likely to be there. And what a charm I found in his cool, loose uniform of shining white, as I was afterwards to figure it, as well as in his generally refined and distinguished appearance, and in the fact that he was engaged, while exposed to our attention, in the commendable act of paring his nails with a smart penknife, and that he didn't allow us to interrupt him. One of my companions, I forget which, had advised me that in these contacts with illustrious misfortune I was to be careful not to stare; and present to me at this moment is the wonder of whether he would think it staring to note that he quite stared, and also that his hands were fine and fair and one of them adorned with a signet ring. I was to have later in life a glimpse of 2 or 3 dismal penitentiaries, places affecting me as sordid, as dark and dreadful, But if the revelation of Sing Sing had involved the idea of a timely warning to the young mind, my small sensibility at least was not reached by the lesson. I envied the bold-eyed celebrity in the array of a planter at his ease. We might have been his slaves, quite as much as I envied Gussie; in connection with which I may remark here that though in that early time I seem to have been constantly eager to exchange my lot for that of somebody else, on the assumed certainty of gaining by the bargain, I fail to remember feeling jealous of such happier persons, in the measure open to children of spirit. I had rather a positive lack of the passion, and thereby, I suppose, a lack of spirit; since if jealousy bears, as I think, on what one sees one's companions able to do, as against one's own falling short, envy, as I knew it at least, was simply of what they were, or in other words of a certain sort of richer consciousness supposed, doubtless often too freely supposed, in them. They were so other, that was what I felt, and to be other almost anyhow, seemed as good as the probable taste of the bright compound wistfully watched in the confectioner's window; unattainable, impossible of course, but as to which just this impossibility and just that privation kept those active proceedings in which jealousy seeks relief quite out of the question. A platitude of acceptance of the poor, actual, the absence of all vision of how, in any degree, to change it, combined with a complacency, an acuity of perception of alternatives, though a view of them as only through the confectioner's hard glass, that is what I recover as the nearest approach to an apology in the soil of my nature for the springing seed of emulation. I never dreamed of competing, a business having in it at the best, for my temper, if not for my total failure of temper, a displeasing ferocity. If competing was bad, snatching was therefore still worse, and jealousy was a sort of spiritual snatching, with which, none the less, all the while, one might have been like so and so, who had such horizons. A helpless little love of horizons I certainly cherished, and could sometimes even care for my own. These always shrank, however, under almost any suggestion of a further range or finer shade in the purple rim offered to other eyes, and that is what I take for the restlessness of envy. It wasn't that I wished to change with everyone, with anyone at a venture, but that I saw gifts everywhere but as mine, and that I scarce knew whether to call the effect of this miserable or monstrous. It was the effect at least of self-abandonment. I mean to visions. There must have been on that occasion of the Sing Sing day, which it deeply interests me to piece together, some state of connection for some of us with the hospitalities of Rhinebeck, the place of abode of the eldest of the Albany uncles; that is of the three most in our view, for there were two others, the eldest of all, a half uncle only, who formed a class quite by himself, and the very youngest, who, with lively interests all his own, had still less attention for us than either of his three brothers. The house at Rhinebeck and all its accessories, which struck our young senses as innumerable, in especial the great bluff of the Hudson on which it stood, yields me images scarcely dimmed, though as the effect but of snatches of acquaintance. There at all events the gently groaning, ever so gently and dryly, Albany grandmother, with the Albany cousins, as to whom I here discriminate; her two adopted daughters, maturest and mildest of the general tribe, must have paused for a stay; a feature of which would be perhaps her juncture with the New York contingent, somewhere sociably achieved, for the befriending of juvenile Gussie. It shimmers here, the whole circumstance, with I scarce know what large innocence of charity and ease. The Gussie pretext, for reunion, all so thin and yet so important an appeal, the simplicity of the interests and the doings, the assumptions and the concessions, each to-day so touching, almost so edifying. We were surely all gentle and generous together, floating in such a clean, light social order, sweetly proof against ennui, unless it be a bad note, as is conceivable, never, never to feel bored, and thankful for the smallest aesthetic or romantic mercies. My vision loses itself withal in vaster connections. Above all, in my general sense of the then grand newness of the Hudson River Railroad, so far at least as its completion to Albany was concerned, a modern blessing that even the youngest of us were in a position to appraise. The time had been when the steamboat had to content us, and I feel how amply it must have done so as I recall the thrill of docking in dim early dawns, the whole hour of the Albany waterside, the night of huge strange paddling and pattering and shrieking and creaking, once ended, and contrast with it all certain long sessions in the train at an age and in conditions when neither train nor traveller had suffered chastening, sessions of a high animation as I recast them, but at the same time of moral intensities of lassitude. The elements here indeed are very much confused and mixed. I must have known that discipline of the hectic interest and the extravagant strain in relation to Rhinebeck only, an étape, doubtless, on the way to New York, for the Albany kinship, but the limit to our smaller patiences of any northward land journey. And yet not the young fatigue, I repeat, but the state of easy wonder is what most comes back. The stops too repeated, but perversely engaging, the heat and the glare too great, but the river, by the window, making reaches and glimpses, so that the great swing of picture and force of light and colour were themselves a constant adventure. The uncles, above all, too preeminent, too recurrent, to the creation of a positive soreness of sympathy, of curiosity, and yet constituting by their presence half the enlargement of the time. For the presence of uncles, incoherent Albany uncles, is somehow what most gives these hours their stamp for memory. I scarce know why, nor do I much, I confess, distinguish occasions. But I see what I see, the long, the rattling car of the old open native form and the old harsh native exposure. The sense of arrival for ever postponed, qualified, however, also by that of having in my hands a volume of Monsieur Arsène Houssaye, Philosophe et Comédienne, remarkably submitted by one of my relatives to my judgment. I see them always, the relatives, in slow circulation, restless and nervous and casual, their note, not less than strikingly genial, but with vaguenesses, lapses, eclipses that deprived their society of a tactless weight. They cheered us on, in their way, born optimists, clearly, if not logically determined ones, they were always reassuring and sustaining, though with a bright brevity that must have taken immensities, I think, for granted. They wore their hats slightly toward the nose, they strolled, they hung about, they reported of progress and of the company, they dropped suggestions, new magazines, packets of the edible deprecated for the immature. They figured, in fine, to a small nephew as the principal men of their time, so far as the two younger and more familiar were concerned, the most splendid as to aspect and apparel. It was none the less to the least shining, though not essentially the least comforting, of this social trio that, if I remember rightly, I owed my introduction to the Chronique galante of the 18th century. There tags itself, at any rate, to the impression, a flutter as of some faint, some recaptured grimace for another of his kindly offices, which I associate somehow with the deck of a steamboat. His production, for our vague benefit, of a literary classic, the Confessions, as he called our attention to them, of the celebrated Rousseau. I catch again the echo of the mirth excited, to my surprise, by this communication, and recover as well my responsive advance toward a work that seemed so to promise. But especially have I it before me that some play of light criticism mostly attended, on the part of any circle, this speaker's most ambitious remarks. For all that, and in spite of oddities of appearance and type, it was Augustus James who spread widest, in default of towering highest, to my wistful view of the larger life, and who covered definite and accessible ground. This ground the house and precincts of Linwood at Rhinebeck harboured our tender years, I surmise, but at few and brief moments. But it hasn't taken many of these to make it the image of an hospitality liberal as I supposed great social situations were liberal. Suppositions on this score having in childhood, or at least they had in mine, as little as possible to do with dry data. Didn't Linwood bristle with great views and other glories, with gardens and graperies and black ponies, to say nothing of gardeners and grooms who were notoriously and quotedly droll, to say nothing in particular of our Aunt Elizabeth, who had been Miss Bay of Albany, who was the mother of the fair and free young waltzing women in New York, and who floats back to me through the Rhinebeck picture aquiline but easy, with an effect of handsome, high-browed, high-nosed looseness, of dressing gowns or streaming shawls, the dowdy, the delightful shawl of the period, and of claws of bright benevolent steel that kept nipping for our charmed advantage, roses and grapes and peaches and currant clusters, together with turns of phrase and scraps of remark that fell as by quite a like flash of shears. These are mere scrapings of gold dust, but my mind owes her a vibration that, however tiny, was to insist all these years on marking, on figuring in a whole complex of picture and drama, the clearest note of which was that of worry and woe, a crisis prolonged in deep-roofed outer galleries, through hot August evenings and amid the dim flare of open windows, to the hum of domesticated insects. All but inexpressible the part played, in the young mind naturally, even though perversely, even though inordinately, arranged as a stage for the procession and exhibition of appearances by matters all of a usual cast, contacts and impressions not arriving at the dignity of shocks, but happening to be to the taste, as one may say, of the little intelligence, happening to be such as the fond fancy could assimilate. One's record becomes, under memories of this order, and that is the only trouble, a tale of assimilations small and fine, out of which refuse, directly interesting to the subject victim only, the most branching vegetations may be conceived as having sprung. Such are the absurdities of the poor dear inward life, when translated, that is, and perhaps ineffectually translated, into terms of the outward, and trying at all to flourish on the lines of the outward, a reflection that might stay here weren't it that I somehow feel morally affiliated, tied as by knotted fibres to the elements involved. One of these was assuredly that my father had again, characteristically, suffered me to dangle, he having been called to Linwood by the dire trouble of his sister Mrs. Temple, and brought me with him from Staten Island. I make the matter out as of the summer of '54. We had come up, he and I, to New York, but our doings there, with the journey following, are a blank to me. I recover but my sense, on our arrival, of being for the first time in the presence of tragedy, which the shining scene, round about, made more sinister, sharpened even to the point of my feeling abashed and irrelevant, wondering why I had come. My aunt, under her brother's roof, had left her husband, wasted with consumption, near death at Albany. Gravely ill herself, she had taken the disease from him as it was taken in those days, and was in the event very scantly to survive him. She had been ordered away in her own interest, for which she cared no scrap, and my father, the person in all his family most justly appealed and most anxiously listened to, had been urged to come and support her in a separation that she passionately rejected. Vivid to me still, as floating across verandahs into the hot afternoon stillness, is the wail of her protest and her grief. I remember being scared and hushed by it, and stealing away beyond its reach. I remember not less what resources of high control the whole case imputed, for my imagination, to my father, and how, creeping off to the edge of the eminence above the Hudson, I somehow felt the great bright harmonies of air and space becoming one with my rather proud assurance and confidence, that of my own connection, for life, for interest, with such sources of light. The great impression, however, the one that has brought me so far, was another matter, only that of the close, lamp-tempered, outer evening aforesaid, with my parent again, somewhere deep within, yet not too far to make us hold our breath for it, tenderly opposing his sister's purpose of flight, and the presence at my side of my young cousin Marie, youngest daughter of the house, exactly of my own age, and named in honour of her having been born in Paris, to the influence of which fact her shining black eyes, her small quickness and brownness, marking sharply her difference from her sisters, so oddly, so almost extravagantly, testified. It had come home to me by some voice of the air that she was spoiled, and it made her in the highest degree interesting. We ourselves had been so associated, at home, without being in the least spoiled. I think we even rather missed it. So that I knew about these subjects of invidious reflection only by literature, mainly, no doubt, that of the nursery, in which they formed, quite by themselves, a romantic class; and the fond fancy always predominant, I prized, even while a little dreading, the chance to see the condition at work. This chance was given to me, it was clear, though I risk in my record of it a final anticlimax, by a remark from my uncle Augustus to his daughter, seated duskily in our group, which included 2 or 3 dim dependent forms. He expressed the strong opinion that Marie should go to bed expressed it, that is, with the casual cursory humour that was to strike me as the main expressional resource of outstanding members of the family, and that would perhaps have had under analysis the defect of making judgment very personal without quite making authority so. Authority they hadn't, of a truth, these all so human outstanding ones. They made shift but with light appreciation, sudden suggestion, a peculiar variety of happy remark in the air. It had been remarked but in the air, I feel sure, that Marie should seek her couch; a truth by the dark wing of which I ruefully felt myself brushed, and the words seemed therefore to fall with a certain ironic weight. What I have retained of their effect, at any rate, is the vague fact of some objection raised by my cousin, and some sharper point to his sentence supplied by her father, promptly merged in a visible commotion, a flutter of my young companion across the gallery as for refuge in the maternal arms, a protest and an appeal, in short, which drew from my aunt the simple phrase that was from that moment so preposterously to count for me. "Come now, my dear, don't make a scene. I insist on your not making a scene." That was all the witchcraft the occasion used, but the note was none the less epoch making. The expression, so vivid, so portentous, was one I had never heard. It had never been addressed to us at home. And who should say now what a world one mightn't at least read into it? It seemed freighted to sail so far, it told me so much about life. Life at these intensities clearly became scenes. But the great thing, the immense illumination, was that we could make them or not as we chose. It was a long time, of course, before I began to distinguish between those within our compass more particularly as spoiled and those producible on a different basis and which should involve detachment, involve presence of mind; just the qualities in which Marie's possible output was apparently deficient. It didn't in the least matter accordingly whether or no a scene was then proceeded to. And I have lost all count of what immediately happened. The mark had been made on me and the door flung open. The passage, gathering up all the elements of the troubled time, had been itself a scene, quite enough of one, and I had become aware with it of a rich accession of possibilities. Chapter 14